In his 4 decades as a director, Robert Bresson produced a wide range of films, running the gamut of genre and subject matter. Yet throughout his work, we find certain characteristics that crop up again and again, leaving an undeniable stamp on the finished product. There's even a name for it in film nerd circles: Bressonian. One of the most consistent elements of the Bressonian style is the elliptical treatment of violence. Bresson never shows violence directly, he only hints at it. One favorite technique is to indicate that violence is imminent and then skip to its aftermath. This can heighten the impact of the scene as our minds scramble to fill in the blanks between the before and after shots, or paradoxically, it can indicate the relative unimportance of the moment to the overall narrative. 1953's A Man Escaped follows Lieutenant Fontaine, a French resistance fighter imprisoned by the Nazis. Armed with little more than his wits and the contents of his cell, he plots a daring escape to Allied territory. This might sound like your typical World War II film, but Bresson's intentions here are anything but standard. There are very few action scenes in the film. What violence does occur is conveyed exclusively through ellipses. Let's look at a scene early in the film when Fontaine is first brought to the prison. He's about to be beaten as punishment for an attempted escape on the way there. We follow the guards as they drag him into a side room, but the camera stops at the door, its attention caught by the bucket of clubs, and then somebody closes the door in our faces. The spatial barrier is then matched with a temporal one as Bresson implements one of his famous dissolves. We come out of that transition to see Fontaine, now unconscious and bloody, being tossed into a cell. That pattern repeats throughout the film. We build toward a moment of bloodshed only to avert our eyes until it's over. But why? In a typical prison film, we'd expect emphasis to be put on the brutality of the guards. We want our heroes to face off against barely human monsters for whom we can't sympathize. And that's doubly true when the bad guys are Nazis. But here, we not only skip over them beating a handcuffed prisoner, we almost skip over them entirely. Only rarely does Bresson show us their faces, and even then, almost all of them are out of focus or in profile. These guys aren't even characters, they're just parts of the obstacle course Fontaine has to run in order to reach freedom. The prison itself becomes the antagonist, and the particulars of our hero's story are no more than a backdrop for Bresson's central thematic concern. The violence inflicted upon him by his captors, even the violence that he commits on them in return, becomes secondary. By contrast, violence becomes the center point for the narrative of L'Argent from 1983. This film, the title of which translates as Money, tells the story of Yvon Target, an apparently honest man who's wrongfully arrested for passing counterfeit bills. The case gets thrown out, but the stain of that arrest follows him everywhere he goes. As his honest life collapses around him, he spirals into criminal activity and violence. And although that violence is again portrayed elliptically, the effect here is quite different. As Bresson made the transition into color films, he made less and less use of his trademark dissolves to move between scenes. Instead, he began to rely more heavily on straight cuts. When applied to the violent scenes in L'Argent, the effect is jarring, it's visceral. Everything changes in the blink of an eye, and to horrifying effect. Our minds reel, trying to bridge the gap between the moments. How the hell did we get here? The relationship between cause and effect is made even more tenuous by Bresson's decision to construct the entire film out of ellipses, not just the murder scenes. Throughout, key narrative moments are presented in the same pattern I mentioned earlier: rising action, aftermath. Rising action, aftermath. The middles keep dropping out, leaving us to figure out what took place in between. By presenting the more commonplace events in the same style as the brutal killings which pepper the second half of the film, Bresson encourages us to see them as two halves of the same coin. Perhaps both are acts of violence. Maybe the dissolution of a marriage or a lie told against a neighbor is just as violent in its own way as a murder. Maybe there's something in the wider mechanism of capitalism and greed that makes the very society in which we are all complicit as brutal as an axe to the face. Greetings, friends and interwebians. Hope you enjoyed my take on the Bressonian style, particularly pertaining to his portrayal of violence. There's obviously a great deal more we could talk about along these lines. This was just one aspect that really stood out to me and that I found interesting. Are you familiar with Bresson's work? If so, what are some of your favorites of his films? Let me know in the comments down below. Please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And as always, I will see you on the flip side.